a couple of quick points and question. One is just, on that question of, the quotas and the thresholds making the differences, I do think we did see in the Seanad, when the Seanad moved past that 30%, that it does make a difference. And not simply because, yes, we had a situation in the last Seanad where very much women across different parties, for example, championed the issue of coercive control and pressed for that to become a piece of legislation. But it's not solely around, will women champion women's issues? What I think is one of the important things around gender equality and diversity in general is the dangers, and it comes back almost to that male privilege piece, the dangers of groupthink. So one thing that we know from research is that when you have more diverse people in the room, everybody who comes into the room prepares better, because they're not simply going in on an assumption that everyone is going to agree with them and have the same experience. So in that sense, it makes everybody work harder in a good way, and it means for better. And that's why we need it, not simply for women to have opportunities, but for better decision making is why we absolutely need to hit these thresholds. And that's why the normalising, and also in terms of good practice. I just wanted to highlight two issues that I think are blocks. When we talked about those people motivated by issues, maybe, and I see it, I spent 15 years in the NGO sector, and I saw brilliant women who wouldn't take that step into politics. And I know it's kind of an invisible piece, which is the question of the risk you take in running, especially when you're not necessarily climbing through a party system, when you may lose, you'll probably lose even sometimes in some situations. And there's a reason when you look at the breakdown of who's in the Oireachtas, there's a lot of solicitors and there's a lot of teachers. And one of the reasons is solicitors tend to be self-employed, so they can plan around being able to run. Teachers have a clause in their contract, every teacher has a clause that says you can take, I forget if it's 3 or 6 weeks, 5 weeks off, 5 years off, but even to run, you get a certain number of weeks off, which says you can take a step out of your job and you have leave from your job to run and know that if you lose, your job is still there. And I think there's sometimes when people are working on issues, they go, is it that risk? I risk losing the job I'm in now. That has the effect on my family. I risk if I'm a public servant. I risk if I'm in an NGO having to leave that. And I do think, actually, it's a labour employment law thing, because women tend to think of those around it, that would allow anybody to say, I want to take 3 weeks and run without jeopardising my ability to contribute in other ways, or the security. And I think that's a practical thing which would address some of the class issues as well that intersect with the gender issues. And then just a very last point I wanted to make is political parties and that culture within it, which I think was mentioned by Emily O'Reilly and by others. I do think there's something there around, and the point that was made about the winnable seat or the non-winnable seat. And I think one of the other key things for women in deciding to run is to know that they'll get the same staffing and resources from a party, and not simply be added in the unwinnable part of the constituency. And sadly, I've also seen in the Seanad elections for some of the parties where, an electorate which effectively is under control of the parties to an extent, in that it is councillors. We've seen that women have not always been given the same party push and support in the electoral process there. And I think that internal piece, and maybe others can comment on how we get that internal culture right to make sure we get the not just on the ticket, but fully and equally supported.
Thanks, Alice-Mary.